I'm Tom Hogan, the director of the Milwaukie Poetry Series, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for our reading. We're always great to see everybody here. I know you've seen the refreshments already, so that's what they're there for, is to help yourself. And if you would like to get something in preparation for Clem's reading, probably in the next 2 or 3 minutes while I'm talking, that might be just the right time to do that, if you would like to do that. And I want to alert you to the tea back here. And it's a 2-step process for the tea, which is unlock and then dispense. It's not a 1-step process, but it's a 2-step. You have to do both. So I want to make some thanks because there's always a lot of people to thank. We're very grateful. And we're grateful to the city of Milwaukie because we've been a committee here for 13 years. So we're in our 13th season. And they've supported us from the beginning, so we're very grateful for that. We also, secondly, are grateful to the Letting Library. So we're a committee of the Letting Library, and big thanks to the Letting Library. And you know, in Milwaukie, we have a new library. Yeah. Yes, we have a new library. Thank you very much. A lot of people have worked many years to get a new library. And we had a meeting this afternoon, a poetry committee meeting. So it's really the first time that we'd seen it, that I'd seen it without all the plans or without everything being in a state of repair when people are saying, well, it's going to be ready in 2 weeks or a month or however long it is. So it's just beautiful. It's just beautiful. We are still here for this month. The readings are here. We have another event coming up Saturday, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute, but that is also here. Then we're moving in to the library next month. So our next reader on the second Wednesday of February, Greg Simon, that reading is going to be in the new Letting Library. I'm still calling it the new Letting Library. So I'm sure that pretty soon it's just going to be the Letting Library. But for now, it's the new Letting Library. I want to welcome our Oregon Poet Laureate Emerita, who is sitting here in the front row, and Pauline Peterson. So can we welcome her? Thank you very much for being here, and I want to say something about our next event. The other January event is January 11th, and that's this Saturday, 2 to 4 here, and it's our annual William Stafford birthday celebration. And Pauline is going to be our featured reader, and she's going to focus on Bill Stafford as Poet Laureate. So Bill Stafford was Poet Laureate 15 years?
15. 1975 to 1990.
To 1990. So she's going to be talking about that and focusing on that part of his career. There'll be a question and answer period. Then there is a open mic afterwards. And I was asked about 10 minutes ago, where's the sign-up sheet? So the sign-up sheet is right over here if you would like to sign up, because that's what the invitation says. And if you want to sign up ahead of time, please contact me and you will get on the list. So that's coming up on this coming Saturday. I want to call your attention to these two. We have 2 of these. So we have the flyer for the readings. Next reader is Greg Simon. And secondly, we have a flyer of other events. These are the other events we're doing now through June. They kind of look the same. They're different, but please go ahead and take one of each if you don't have any. So that's what they're for. I want to remind you about your telephonic devices. So if you could silence them, your cell phones, beepers, pagers, smartphones, etc., so they don't go off while Clem is reading. We do have a broadside of one of Clem's poems. So does everybody have one of those? I think if you don't have one of those, my lovely wife Jane or one of the other committee members will get you one. That's the third group I want to thank, and that's the Milwaukie Poetry Series Committee. So only a couple of our members are able to be here tonight, which is me and Emmett Wheatfall. So Emmett's in the back. Do you want to stand or wave? Let's give the committee because you don't have something happen unless you have a group of people working on it. So a lot of thanks to everybody who, past members, current members, people who have worked on the Milwaukie Poetry Series, people that are in adjunct capacities for us. For example, our videographer tonight. So Bev, thank you for doing that. Well, this is an exciting reading. I've been looking forward to it for some time. We're going to hear Clemens Starck read in just a minute. He was born in 1937. He was a Princeton dropout and former merchant seaman. He supported his literary and intellectual interests for more than 50 years by working with his hands, mainly as a carpenter and construction foreman. He is the author of 7 books of poetry, including the recently published Cathedrals and Parking Lots. So we see some of Clem's books over here. He is a widower, he has 3 grown children, and lives on 40-some acres in the foothills of the Coast Range in Western Oregon. So that's what Clem sent me. And if you go on his website, Clemens Starck, you will also learn that his first book of poems, Journeyman's Wages, received the 1996 Oregon Book Award, as well as the William Stafford Memorial Poetry Award from the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association. His next 2 books, Studying Russian on Company Time, 1999, and China Base in 2002, were also finalists for the Oregon Book Award in those respective years. Traveling Incognito, a letterpress chapbook from Wood's work in Seattle, appeared in 2004, and Rembrandt Chainsaw, another letterpress chapbook, was published in the fall of 2011. We've already heard about Cathedrals and Parking Lots. I'm very much looking forward to Clem reading. Would you join me in welcoming our poet for the evening, Clemens Starck?
Thank you, Tom. Good to be here. Good to see a lot of old friends and a lot of total strangers. Yeah, so I was trying to okay, so first we got to do this. So, can you guys hear me in back okay if I don't eat the mic? Way back there, can you hear me okay?
I think you could use it.
I could use it. All right, I will.
Well, it depends on others around here.
Yeah.
No, that's nice.
Is that good for you back there? Okay, good. So I was going to look up when I last read in the Milwaukie Poetry Series, which has been a few years, but I forgot to do it. So I don't know when it was. But so I read at the Pond House, which you all know, which is a really nice venue, and I was sorry to learn that I was not going to be reading at the Pond House again, but so be it. We're here. So. Okay, so I'm going to start with some, as most of you know, I made a living most of my life as a carpenter, construction foreman. So I'm going to start with a few carpentry poems, some newer and some older. So we'll start with this one. This is for my friend Mo, who loves this poem. It's called Me and Milwaukie. Job is nearly over. Me and Milwaukie, all that's left of the crew. Sunk in the hillside, hundreds of tons of reinforced concrete, formed in the shape of a drum, 92 feet in diameter, 18 feet deep. It could be a kiva, or a hat box, or look from the air like a missile silo. It could be a storage tank for toxic waste. It could be a vault to house the national treasure. In any case, it's finished, ready for backfill. Now, it's the Earth's. And I'm left with Milwaukie, who likes to drink beer after work and tell stories. construction stories, ex-wife stories, stories like how he clubs possums to death with a 2x4 when he finds them prowling in back of his warehouse at night. He laughs, telling the stories. Milwaukie quit drinking once. After a year and 9 months, he decided he'd rather die of alcohol than boredom. I know what he means. I work for Milwaukie Construction. When it rains, we work in the rain. When it snows, we work in the snow. I am Milwaukie's right-hand man. When he laughs, I laugh too. Me and Milwaukie. So that was a job, one of many jobs that I worked on. I worked out of the Carpenters Local in Salem, Local 1065. And that was a job in down in the valley outside the town of Amity. You all probably know where Amity is. But I got into the carpentry trade back in San Francisco in the early 60s. And this next poem, which is a more recent poem than me and Milwaukie, but actually recounts an experience much earlier than working for Milwaukie in Amity. This, I was talking about this with my friend Will earlier, or with Matt actually, about building bridges. I worked on a couple of bridges. I worked on the Marion Street Bridge, Salem, the westbound bridge out of Salem. But this was an earlier bridge job. So this poem is called Riding the Highball. I tried contracting for a while in San Francisco, but my career as an entrepreneur was short-lived, and I went back to work out of the hall. Carpenters Local 483, the Dago Local. Right off, the dispatcher sends me out to a job site. Says for me to see Frank. Frank says, "Can you work high?" "Sure," I say, bluffing. So I got the job and got to confront every day for over a year my fear of heights. It was a bridge job. To get to where the work was, we either climbed or rode the headache ball, the high ball, like the lead sinker on a fishing line. This was a solid steel, 500-pound, oversized basketball, attached directly above the hook on the whip line of a 52-ton truck crane. Grab the cable, sit on the ball, cross your legs, and pucker up, squeezing the cable between your thighs. Then signal the operator and hang on tight, up and away, 60, 80, 100 feet in the air, dangling out over the construction site. There's no rush like the rush you get from riding the highball, says my partner, a long-haired druggie, a pilebuck from Oakland, and he should know. Fear and glory. That's what it was. Fear and glory. The kind of job that won't do much for your resume, but after work, you can hang up your tool belt and swagger a little. So this next poem goes back a long ways. This actually might be the earliest poem that is in my collected collected poems, Cathedrals and Parking Lots. I started writing back in the early 60s. Well, I actually started late 50s, but really mostly in the early 60s. And, at that time there were no poetry workshops. There was no opportunity for learning how to write poetry. So basically I took it upon myself to learn how to write poetry. And I imitated the classic English poets and all the great modern American poets. And so I wrote rhymed poetry. I wrote very traditional poetry for, 5 years or so. And then I wound up having to figure out a way to make a living. I knew I was not going to make a living as a poet. And so I wound up going through the carpentry apprenticeship program, and this is in San Francisco, 1960, 62, 63. And it was a wonderful experience working as a carpenter, with my hands, basically to support myself as a poet. So I sort of, it was such an amazing experience. I wanted to incorporate it into my poetry, and I was not really able to do that, writing sonnets and villanelles and so forth and so on. So I broke out into a freer form verse. And this is one of the first poems I wrote in that vein. And it's about, my experience working as an apprentice carpenter. So the poem is called Raising the Grain. And there's an epigraph to the poem, which is basically a paragraph from one of the books that I was studying in order to become a journeyman carpenter. So the epigraph goes like this. The grain of rough lumber will show plainly in the finished concrete, even though raising of grain is prevented by oiling the forms. If more pronounced grain marks are desired, the grain can be raised by wetting the lumber before oiling. A still more effective method is to spray the sheathing lumber with ammonia. From a volume called Forms for Architectural Concrete, Portland Cement Association, 1952. Here's the poem. It's in 3 parts. Raising the Grain. The lot is vacant, except for me and my toolbox. My toolbox is huge and is painted brown. It contains little racks and holsters, numerous compartments, which hold all the tools I'll need for this job, including a hacksaw. What am I waiting for? Everything is ready. My chisels were dull, but for 2 hours I've been sharpening them. I am holding a hammer. I am going to drive a nail. But my hands are smashed and bleeding. The knuckles are raw. It won't be easy. It's never as easy as it looks. What are you building? A piano? And when I have driven the nail, I am going to clench it. Already this year, I've built a Serbian Orthodox church and a mortuary, Chapel of the Sunset, 26th Avenue and Irving, plus a number of other less tangible structures. My union dues are all paid up, and I plan to continue in the trade. Bookshelves for a crippled lady, a cage for a boa constrictor. The country is going to hell, but a good mechanic can always find work. raising the grain. Well, most of you here know of the great 20th century German poet Rainer Maria Rilke. So he was a favorite of mine. I know a little bit of German, and I've read some of his poetry in German, and loved it. But from what I knew of the man himself, it was kind of the diametric opposite to the life that I chose as a poet. So this next poem was really a revenge poem. So this is my revenge on Rilke. It's called Rainer Maria Rilke Goes Construction. I tried to imagine Rilke showing up for work one morning on the construction site, his sad, dark eyes and drooping mustache conspicuous under the yellow hard hat, not to mention the angels accompanying him. That's the new laborer, somebody says. He can't hardly speak English, says somebody else. And then, as if on cue, all the bosses I've ever worked for merge and descend on him in a cyclone of animadversion. Angels scatter like dandelion fluff. Rilke is visibly shaken. I can see the poor bastard doesn't know which end is up. And so I take him aside, and in a friendly way I say, Rainer, get your ass in gear. We got work to do. Quit fooling with them angels. Or else I take another tack, back off, and ask him something technical, like, what is the sound of a jackhammer breaking up concrete in heaven? He doesn't savvy, but later, at coffee, I ask the other laborers how the new guy is working out. And one of them says affably, not bad for a poet. Everybody likes him. I can't get over it. He's just like one of us, the plumber foreman tells me once. They call him the Dutchman, or just plain Kraut, as in, hey, Kraut, get us some 8-foot 2x4s, will you? At night he hits the bars, and I hear stories how the women really go for him. His accent, his sensitivity. The upshot of it is, in this scenario, Rilke goes on to great success as a construction super. I drop out, get steady work, fixing doors and mending broken windows, healing the wounds in buildings. Now and then, I get a letter. He always asks, what is the sound of a jackhammer breaking up concrete in heaven? My revenge. I really did often consider in the early days of having chosen the wrong occupation. Well, here's another early poem. I quit writing poetry after I started in the late 50s, as I mentioned, writing poetry. I became an apprentice carpenter, got my journeyman certificate, and so forth. And then at a certain point, after 6, 7, 8 years, I think, I decided to quit writing. And that's another long story. But I did. I quit writing. I did not write for 7 or 8 years. I wanted to see if it was something that I really wanted to do, that if it was something that was really important to me to continue the effort. So it's hard work being a poet. It's hard work writing poems. And so I wanted to test myself, more or less. And at that time, I think, I went to sea. I shipped out as a merchant seaman, and that was so interesting to me that poetry was, forget it. So, but then, years later, 7 or 8 years later, I thought maybe I'd try it again to see if it still had meaning for me. And this was kind of this poem that I'm going to read is kind of my coming back into poetry, deciding that maybe I wanted to continue exerting that kind of effort to write. So it's called Reading the Gospels in the Lee Hotel. Panorama Land, the tourist folders call this place. The country hereabouts unfolds, range after snowy range in all directions. And after that, clouds. According to the account of what happened, as narrated by John in this translation, Jesus said, I came into this world so that people might be set asunder, so that those who cannot see should see, and those who can see should become blind. I came here looking for a place to settle, hopeful this might be it this time, traveling from a distant constellation to be here in this room, a newcomer, strange to the local customs. And so it was. I was reading the 4 Gospels, listening to music through the static on a San Francisco station. Wallpaper peeling, woodwork encrusted with paint, one bare light bulb dangling by its wires from the high ceiling. End of the line for lonesome travelers, down and out, one flight up over the bar, Lee Hotel. A drunk lurches, singing down the hall, body trying clumsily to follow the moves its spirit makes. The radiator hisses. For judgment I am come into this world, is how the King James Version renders the passage. After midnight, I go out, bundled in checkered mackinaw and wool watch cap, to walk the icy main street, 4 blocks up and 5 blocks back on the other side to an all-night cafe. Cheeseburger and coffee, I say to the faded waitress. She's new in town herself, she says, moving with accomplished grace behind the counter toward the stainless steel coffee urn. Reading the Gospels in the Lee Hotel. Well, this next one is a little longer poem, and I decided to read this because I suspected my friend Ken was going to be here tonight, and he mentioned that he wanted to hear this poem again, which he apparently heard me read once before. I don't read it that often because it's a little longer. It's a longer poem. It's a poem in it's like a miniature novel in 7 chapters. The chapters are only this long, but still, it's a story. So it draws on an experience I had when I was living in Russia in the 1990s. I spent some time in Russia. I've been involved with the Russian language for quite some time now. And so this poem is called, has a Russian title, but the word in Russian is similar to the word in English. In English we have the word protocol. You all know that word. But so Russian also has this. It's a Greek word. It actually has something to do. It's an ancient term. It has to do with the first part of a papyrus scroll that is somehow glued to the rest of the scroll. I'm not exactly sure, but anyway, in Russia, it has a slightly different twist than it has in English, and it's pronounced a little differently. It's protokol. So in Russian, you can take the record of proceedings in a court, for example, are called protokol. Or if taking down the minutes of a meeting, if you're having a meeting and someone is transcribing the meeting, that Russian makes a verb of it, and it's called to protokolировать, to protocolize, to take down the minutes. Anyway, this is a poem called Protokol. And again, as I say, it describes an incident that happened to me when I was in Russia in the 90s. So here, as I say, it's a story. It's a story. I'm sitting in the police station telling my story. Tatiana is there too, helping. 6 times I tell the story, each time to a different person. And each time, if I may say so, the story gets better. I was on a trolley bus. The trolley bus was crowded, very crowded. I was conscious of my body and of the 5 other bodies pressing against mine. I had just bought a book, several books. One was by Zoshenko. He's one of my favorite authors. Now a man is writing down my story with a fountain pen at a desk that looks like it was manufactured before the revolution, or maybe just after the revolution, at about the time Zoshenko was telling his stories. Another man is at another desk, a cigarette in one hand. The index finger of the other is jabbing at a typewriter. He's typing someone else's story. Tomorrow is a holiday, Victory Day. I was on my way to the university. I had to wait a long time for the trolley bus. That's why it was so crowded. The man whose job it is to write down my story ponders before he writes. Each sentence is premeditated. His composure is almost beatific. His penmanship is also quite remarkable. The other man is having trouble with his typewriter. The carriage has jammed. Mashinka slomals. Typewriter's broke. He pounds the desk. He pounds the typewriter. The room is drab and bare. Green wallpaper, a floral pattern, water-stained. It looks like it, too, dates from the time of Zoshenko. Finally, it's my turn to write. I write what I am told. And I write very carefully also because I am writing in Russian. Tatiana gives me some leaves to chew. They taste like chicory. Очень полезный, she says, very healthy. and goes on to inform me that what I have just written is to affirm that what the man has written is correct. And it is correct. It is my story. Now the man is copying what he has written onto a second sheet of paper. He has that look of a missionary, zealously translating Paul's epistles into some outlandish tongue. Otherwise, he seems like a reasonable man. He smiles sometimes and asks me questions, the same questions he asked before. I try to tell my story as simply as I can. I was on a trolley bus, the number 4 trolley bus. I got on at Lenin Square. As it turns out, there is a third sheet of paper to be inscribed with my story. But this time, my story is abridged. Only the important parts are told. There's little likelihood my wallet will be returned, the man concedes. But still, we have to do what we are doing. It's protocol. And he takes from his briefcase another sheet of paper. This one is not plain, however, like the others. This one is a form to be filled out. And at the top is written in Russian letters, protocol. After 3 hours and 40 minutes, we say goodbye. I thank the man. I thank Tatiana for her help. And I set out on foot across the boundless distances of Russia. A metaphor, of course. In fact, I'm walking along Kievskaya, trying not to look like a foreigner. Suddenly, for no reason, I recall the story of the peach blossom spring. It's not Russian. It's an old Chinese story. But it's a good story. Zoshenko would have liked it. All right, we'll take a different tack here. So, you all know, well, you don't all know, but I'm going to point out to you now, you will know, because I'm going to tell you that those, when you came through that door, that pair of double doors, the device that closed that door behind you is called a door closer. And that particular door closer happens to be an LCN, I know that brand, and that particular configuration of door closers, that's called a parallel arm installation, meaning the closer is on this side and the doors are, swinging out. So I in the later years of my carpentry career, quote unquote, I worked at Oregon State University as a maintenance carpenter, and I worked on door closers. Among other things, I worked on fixing doors. I became the doorman at OSU. So at one point I thought, well, poets are supposed to write, or writers, all writers are supposed to write about what they know. And what do I know? Well, I know about door closers. I worked on a lot of door closers. I probably know more than anyone else in this room about door closers. So I wrote this poem. It's an educational poem. I'm teaching you something that you perhaps don't know. It's called A Brief Lecture on Door Closers. It goes like this. Although heretofore unconsidered in verse or in song, The ordinary door closer is, I submit, a device well worth considering, consisting primarily of a spring and a piston in combination. Here's how it works. You open a door, either pushing or pulling. The spring is compressed, the piston extended. Now, having passed through the doorway, you relinquish control, and the door closer takes over. The spring remembers how it was. It wants to return, but the urge is damped by the resistance the piston encounters, snug in its cylinder filled with hydraulic fluid. Such is the mechanism of the door closer, invented in 1876 by Charles Norton, when a slamming door in a courtroom in Cincinnati repeatedly disrupted the administration of justice. Whether concealed beneath the threshold or overhead in the head jamb, whether surface mounted as a parallel arm installation or as a regular arm, door closers are ever vigilant, silently performing their function, rarely complaining. Whereas doors can be metaphorical, as in, for example, he could never unlock the door to her heart. Door closers cannot. Remember this when you pass through and the door closes behind you with a soft thud and final click as the latch bolt engages the strike. Door closers. So I lived down in the valley outside of Dallas, between Dallas and Falls City. This next poem recounts an episode that occurred, 7 or 8 years ago when we had a severe ice storm. And our power was out for a few days, and I was working, trying to clear my driveway and helping the linemen clear the power lines in order to get the power back into operation. So this one is called It Could Be Worse. It Could Be Worse. Good. It's a good winter poem. It could be worse. Call it sleet or call it snow. It's coming down so hard, it's hard to see the two linemen up there at the crossarm of the pole. They're working from the bucket of their boom truck with come-alongs and tackle to retrieve our downed power lines and reattach us to the grid. 4 days without power after an early winter storm savaged the countryside. Out all day with a chainsaw, clearing limbs and broken trees from the right-of-way. I'm standing now in the snow with the line crew foreman, peering up, remembering days like this on a construction site when I wished I'd become a librarian. It's cold, it's getting dark, I'm soaking wet. The sleet has turned to freezing rain. Some fucking weather, I say to the guy over the roar of the truck's diesel. And he replies, it could be worse. You could be sitting at a fucking desk 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. It could be worse. Well, this next one has some bearing on my recent experiences, although it was written a number of years ago. I won't say any more about it. It's, the title of the poem is Echocardiogram. Echocardiogram. With electrodes attached to my chest and wires that lead to a large apparatus resembling a pinball machine, my heart is being monitored. I'm watching it beat on a computer screen. At the same time, I'm thinking about my old Chevy pickup, 48 years since it rolled off the assembly line. I'm exactly 20 years older than that. No wonder the valves are worn. The kid who's handling the equipment is called an echo tech. He learned how to do it at school in Spokane. With my golden years in jeopardy, it's time to ask some questions. What do you make of those old Bolsheviks who confessed to crimes they never committed? Or how about the Wannsee Conference, where finishing touches were put to the final solution? What about global warming? Echocardiogram. Okay, so I'm going to wind this up with, these are all kind of newer poems. Some of them, I think this first one is in the collected poems, but the others are not. So this one is called A Short Essay on Trouble. Troubleshooting is not exactly the same as looking for trouble, although the two could easily be confused. Once troubled by the side effects of a late-life love affair, sleepless nights, whole days given over to angst, punctuated by spasms of doubt, I thought of consulting Maimonides, the medieval Jewish philosopher who, late in the 12th century, compiled the treatise he called Guide for the Perplexed. Written in Arabic, but with Hebrew letters. It promised to be a troubleshooting guide if ever there was one. However, as I was then led to believe, Maimonides was mainly involved in a lengthy attempt to confirm Aristotle, or else, some claimed, secretly, to refute Aristotle. So I didn't read Maimonides. Instead, I recalled what my old friend, the poet Robert Peterson, had to say about trouble. But trouble brought out the best in me, he wrote in his poem, How I Became a Poet, and went on to say, and poets, I was told, can't be told how to think, what to feel, or vice versa, and have lots of trouble. So that's what I became. Well, this didn't entirely solve my problem. It certainly wasn't something I could refute. A short essay on trouble. All right, here's one. So I mentioned, I think, earlier that I had gone to sea for a time. So I shipped out, this was in the late 60s. I shipped out, this was during the Vietnam War, and I made many trips to the Far East. So more recently, I got to thinking about that experience, and I wrote this poem just trying to recall little incidents, little episodes of what I remembered from my trips to Vietnam. So it's called Remembering Vietnam, 1967. Da Nang, Quy Nhon, and Cam Ranh Bay, 3 ports along the coast where merchant ships like ours put in, delivering the wherewithal for war. The narrow, dusty streets of those provincial towns were choked with convoys of U.S. Army trucks and huge earth-moving equipment, olive drab and ominous. One time, anchored offshore, we watched a fighter jet swoop down, then suddenly pull up, climbing abruptly, leaving behind a bright orange flash and billowing black smoke. Napalm, someone said. Another trip, another girl, late one night, when in the moonlight black pajamaed figures lurked and leaped across the adjacent rooftops, she drew the curtains tight and whispered, "Viet Cong." What else do I remember from that time? Ruby gold cigarettes in the pink and gold pack. A barefoot carpenter who held the lumber he was sawing by gripping it with his toes. The young Chinese who invited me to dinner with his family, a chicken claw floating in the soup. A girl named Mai I drank tea with to celebrate my 30th birthday in the cafe her parents owned. The shipmate I coaxed out of a knife fight on the waterfront. His name was James. He was the ordinary on the 12 to 4. But most distinctly, I remember the broken down old seaman on the beach at Cam Ranh Bay, an ancient mariner who looked at me as though I were a younger version of himself. And in a voice I've never forgotten, said, "I've been everywhere, and I've done everything, and I don't have the strength or courage to go on." Remembering Vietnam, 1967. All right, here's a few short poems to wind this up. This is the poem that Tom printed up on the broadside that you have. You can hear me read it. So you all know that international airports, I guess in general, have a 3-letter code, PDX being Portland, of course, and VIE is Vienna. I flew to Vienna a year or so ago. So this is called En route, PDX to VIE. During the flight to Vienna, a gentleman seated across the aisle from me is watching a National Geographic documentary on a small TV screen attached to the back of the seat directly in front of him. A wolf is taking down a caribou. Behind me, a few rows back, a child starts crying inconsolably. We're cruising at 35,000 feet just off the southern tip of Greenland. Shortly before departure, A telephone message informed me I have exactly 3.5 years left in the battery life of my pacemaker. It was that pause on the answering machine that caught my attention. You have 3.5 years left. All right. Here's a few more little short ones. As I mentioned, I live down in the valley. Some of you might know this place. This is a road that connects 99W with the Kings Valley Highway, about 12 miles long, running east to west. And when I worked at OSU for 15, 16 years, I drove it every day to and from work. So I found myself driving to Corvallis. Again, that's the way I get to Corvallis, driving Airlie Road, it's called. A ghost town, a town that is basically just a little crossroads. It used to be actually a town called Airlie. So this is called Some Passing Thoughts While Driving Airlie Road Again. A house, a barn, a grove of trees, clouds accumulating in the west. How many times did I see this and say these words as I drove Airlie Road each evening, headed home from work? Wife gone, children grown, retired now, but still in dreams, I find myself out on a job site, nailing up batter boards, pulling a string line, putting in footings again. Everywhere now along Airlie Road, fields of ryegrass and tall fescue, even Christmas tree farms, are being converted to filbert orchards. Trump and climate change notwithstanding, maybe there's a future in nuts. All right, last two little poems. This is one just called Feeding the Birds. Feeding the birds. Undeterred by my presence on the veranda, a single goldfinch, bolder than the rest, swoops down and perches at a feeder. Feeding the birds is one of my pleasures, like cutting firewood, reading Chekhov, watching baseball, or film noir, dozing on the couch in front of the wood stove, daydreaming, looking out at the birds. Why is it lately, with that jackass in the White House and the planet in such a perilous state, sometimes these feel more like guilty pleasures, self-indulgences, fiddling while Rome burns? Okay, one final poem. And this is a very short poem, so you're going to have to listen very closely, or you'll miss it. It's called Taters. That's apostrophe S. A place. Taters. Country music and bacon are on the menu at Taters Cafe, as well as a Denver, a Western, or a Florentine omelet. I go there sometimes when I'm feeling low. It's surprising what a 3-egg omelet with hash browns and whole wheat toast will do. Thank you all. I've forgotten the protocol here, but I'm certainly open for Q&A if you guys want to do it. Tom,
Yeah,
what?
Q&A.
Great, great.
Any questions, anyone?
Yeah, Mo.
I've always wanted to know if when you go up on the Highball, you're carrying your lunch bag.
If I'm what?
If you got your lunchbox,
No,
do you have to carry anything?
No.
Just you on the Highball.
Just me
That
on-
makes me feel better.
it's me and my tool belt, tool
So
belt.
you did have a belt.
No, just a tool belt. No, this was long before OSHA. I mean, when I think about it now, it seems to anyone who's familiar with the construction trade in recent years, it's beyond belief. No, we just climbed on the ball and rode up. That's how we got up there.
No, I do. I just hated thinking about you with like your thermos thing.
So here's the thing. Let me tell you this. This is so I was kind of chicken. I mean, I sat on the highball like this. My partner stood with his feet on my thighs, and we went up together like that. That was beyond my level of courage. Paul Ann.
Where's Morgan Stanley water, Clemens Starck?
Oh, I got this from my financial advisor. It's the only small bottle that I know. I thought I was afraid. I was afraid someone was going to ask that.
I mean, okay, well, it was interesting that you were drinking your little bottle of Morgan.
Yeah, Morgan Stanley.
I have a more, I think, pertinent question. So your revenge poem for Rilke, revenge is something that you take for some harm that's been done to you or something.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, so I wanna know where the revenge comes in.
Well, maybe it's the wrong word. I mean, I spent, as you know, not everyone here knows, but I mean, I spent many, many, many years before I was ever published. Before I ever got any kind of recognition as a poet. I wrote for 35 years, with absolute total solitude, all by myself, and not really even connecting with other poets,
But you had those Chinese poets with you.
Well, yeah, sure, I had my heroes. So, I mean, there were times when I was really seriously thinking I had made a big effing mistake, by choosing the way of life that I had chosen, and just thinking of a poet like Rilke, whose work I admired, how drastically different that was from. I mean, I still remember a particular moment. It was not while I was riding the Highball, but it was on the same job. I was climbing one of the structures up to the bridge where we were working, and just a feeling of bleakness and desolation and depression of. I really fucked up. This is how come I did this? I should have, been a professor of literature or something, whatever. So when I say a revenge, it's more, I don't know. Can you think of a better word? It was like, getting even with. Well, fuck it. That's what I did. That's what I did. I can make a poem out of this. You know what I mean? And an awful lot of what I did, and many of the poems I read tonight, it was that kind of challenge, making a poem out of unpoetic material, or not traditional.
You made a successful construction worker out of him too.
Yeah, right. He was a success. Yeah, Tom.
Who else do you admire and who else do you read?
Oh, well, all the poets in this room, all my friends. I read my friends, I really like their work. It's hard to, I can't say that I really read, well, that's not true. I read a lot of poetry, but mainly standard fare. I love William Carlos Williams, Pound and Eliot. I learned to write by reading, well, particularly William Butler Yeats. He was my hero for years. I read Yeats, and the other poet of equal importance for me was Edwin Muir, Scottish poet. Muir and Yeats were my heroes. I read them every day, and I sedulously imitated them, for years, trying to write. That's when I was writing in rhymes, writing formal, traditional poetry. But then when I started out, I tried imitating William Carlos Williams, Wallace Stevens, Robinson Jeffers, Robert Frost, Pound, Eliot. That's how I learned to write, by just slavishly imitating other poets. But I can't say that I have, as I say, other than friends whom I really like. I don't know, here's a poet that not everyone of you perhaps know, but for whatever reason, I've become kind of a friend of his, but he struck me when I found a book of his once in a used bookstore in Corvallis many years ago, and was just totally taken with it. It's a poet who has some national reputation now, I guess. August Kleinzahler. He's I guess I would call him a favorite poet. I just like his. Yeah. But someone else had a question.
How about Vietnam? When you went there, was it dangerous to enter the harbors there? Was it mined?
No, well, I was in port. I was a merchant seaman.
Yeah, but getting there.
No. No, we were, on those occasions when our ship was carrying ammunition, we were I've forgotten even the term, we're not quarantined, but we were had a special status. We flew a special flag, and we didn't come into the dock until we were okayed to do that. We mainly anchored, offshore. But no, it was not dangerous. It was just the incredible feel. I love those people, the Vietnamese people that I met. I just absolutely loved.
Have you been back?
No, I never have been back. I was there, I don't know, half a dozen, maybe a dozen times, in the 60s. But no, I have never.
Love it.
Never. Have you been back?
My son was there. He's a poet. He just loves Vietnam.
How bad? Yeah. Yes.
Do you have a favorite Chinese poet or a place of entry for someone interested in?
Well, yes, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked. So my introduction to Chinese poetry came in the mid '60s, after I had been writing for maybe five or 6 years. And my friend, actually a friend who was mentioned in one of the poems I read tonight, the poet Robert Peterson. Don't know if you know, talking about favorite poets. I mean, now there's a poet that I love. I love Bob Peterson's poetry. He was a friend, but he was also a mentor to me. I mean, he's one of the few poets that I think of as a mentor. I learned a lot from his writing, from his poetry. Anyway, he introduced me to a book which you probably can still find copies of. It's called The White Pony. Sure. And that was it's an anthology of Chinese poetry. And well, that's all I can say. It just, wow. Here are these people just writing about everyday things, just ordinary. I mean, this is all in translation, and I became fully. I studied Chinese for a number of years without ever achieving an ability to read. The poems themselves in Chinese, but I got a feeling for the language, so that I can feel my way through the English translation to the original in a way. But that was my introduction. And as far as favorite poets, I don't know that I could pick one more than another. Du Fu, Li Bo, Wang Wei, Zhu Dongpo, they're all great. Terrific. My friend, I have a good friend, Bill Porter, who's a translator of Chinese poetry, Red Pine. He translates under the name Red Pine. Check out Red Pine. Yeah, check out his translations. Very good. But there actually are, since I first became interested, since the mid-'60s, there have been many really good translations of Chinese poetry that have come out that were not available then.
I'm trying to remember who the translators were in The White Pony. Do you recall?
Robert, he was not the translator, he was the editor of it. The interesting thing about that was an anthology compiled during World War II by Robert, can't think of his name, he's an Englishman, who was stationed in the west of China during the war, when China was occupied by the Japanese. And many, many Chinese scholars had fled to Chongqing in the west. And he basically tapped that reservoir of exiled Chinese scholars. So these were all the translations in that book are not native English speakers. So the translations are a little quaint, maybe at times. They were, Chinese scholars who had learned English as a second language. So in that sense, that anthology has a little bit, it's not quite, what's the word, trendy or fashionable, whatever. I mean, there are better translations of Chinese poetry, but that's the one that I grew up with. Yes, Will?
What was some of the attraction to Russia and learning to speak Russian?
Whoa. Well, the story of my involvement with Russia is basically told in that little book, Studying Russian Unaccompanied Time. I mean, it starts out with my prose introduction in which I say that the day before I began studying Russian, I had no intention whatsoever of studying Russian. It was a complete, sudden inspiration having to do, as you might suspect, with a woman. Right? I met a Russian woman. I said, whoa, whoa. The problem was she didn't speak English, see? She spoke it very brokenly. So I said, well, I'll help you with your English, and you can teach me Russian. That was 1991, and I've been at it ever since. I spent this morning reading Chekhov.
In one of your poems you mentioned, I think it went something like, the Bolsheviks told lies about things they didn't do.
Right. Why did they confess to crimes they never committed? Don't you know that whole story of the purges in the late 30s in Russia?
Bolshevik Revolution.
Well, this is not the Bolshevik Revolution. This is in the 30s, 20 years after the Bolshevik Revolution.
What spoke to you about? What about that spoke to you?
About,
The telling of lies.
well, what an incredible thing to stand in front of a court of inquiry and state things that are blatantly untrue, that you know full well are going to result in you standing in front of the firing squad, basically. But still believing in the idea, the idea of communism, the idea, the thing that you've believed in, that you've devoted your life to, the idea that you have devoted your life to, that you are willing to lie and to sacrifice your life in this peculiar manner by lying. What that says of us human beings is fascinating to me. I mean, terrifying and fascinating.
Kind of sounds familiar today.
Yeah.
One more question.
Anybody? Yeah.
Well, I'm over here. Folks are over here. You're over here for a while.
I'll stick around.
Some broadsides.
I'll stick around, yep.
Yeah. Thanks again.
Hey.